the State of the Union addresses with this administration. I think foreign policy did take a big back seat, except when the president appeared to put a lot of faith in some sort of diplomacy with Iran. And of course, to discuss this, Stephen Yates is with the D.C. International Advisory online at dciadvisory.org, foreign policy expert and former advisor to Dick Cheney. Stephen, the president's remarks in his State of the Union, especially as it concerns Iran, I thought seemed either naive or just so he could talk about Iran and get it over with. I don't really see any sort of diplomatic solution beyond what we have done. They don't seem very diplomatic.
No, they don't. But it's really part of a piece of a broader strategy that hasn't worked for a long time, whether it's North Korea or looking at Syria and Iran. You basically have leaderships that have made strategic choices. They're not going to be induced or negotiated away from them. We have unpalatable options in trying to contain or disrupt their destructive capabilities. But especially when it comes to Iran, I mean, there's just been no pushing them back from the Obama administration.
Yes, and he did in his address, as we discussed the other day. He said one sentence about reducing the nuclear arsenal and engaging Russia in this, which is something that he's going to be discussing with Vladimir Putin in the weeks to come. It just said that we're just going to continue the global effort to secure nuclear materials that could fall into the wrong hands. This seems like a Bush doctrine on steroids, Stephen.
Well, it is in a sense. The President Bush did, I think, in one of his most articulate moments, talk about the very scary potential nexus between violent Islamist groups and the world's worst weapons. And he talked about the axis of evil, which is getting a bit of a revival these days, but. That is, I think, the most dire threat to civilization as we know it in the years ahead. Now, the Obama administration is using some of those words, but their deeds are actually making that nexus even more likely.
Right. He mentioned North Korea and said, called it a provocation, their third nuclear test, and said that they're going to we'll stand by our allies and strengthen our own missile defense. And then there's, of course, a lot of discussion that, one of the reasons North Korea did what it did is because it has essentially full permission of China. I don't know if anything that he said in the 1-2 sentences that he said about North Korea would be any sort of deterrent to them acting further. It seemed nothing he said in foreign policy seemed very convincing, Stephen, nor did it seem very defiant of in the face of our enemies.
Well, I agree completely. I think there's perhaps a simple reason for it. He just doesn't believe in this stuff. It's not what animates him. It's not what motivates him. His eyes are on the prize at home, which seems to be endless spending and expansion of the state and co-option of elements of our society. And the world is frankly a distraction from that and gobbles up resources he'd rather allocate here. But there's no way in the world young Kim Jong-un was shaking in his little boots in North Korea because the president said you'll be further isolated. It's already the most sanctioned country in the world. There's no variation of diplomacy that hasn't already been tried. And frankly, North Korea is an adversary. China is its primary enabler, and we need to begin treating both of them as exactly that.
Right. Oh, no, I would agree. And it seemed, I don't know, I was left unimpressed with his remarks on those two particular situations. The thing that concerned me the most, and I wanted to ask you about this, he said numerous times throughout the foreign policy section, which was about 3/4 of the way through his speech, said that the organization that attacked us on 9/11 is a shadow of its former self. Of course, he didn't clarify which 9/11, and said Al Qaeda has, they're essentially. He said before they've been decimated. He said before that we're destroying their core. Is it naive for this administration to think that Al Qaeda has somehow been rendered incapable of carrying out the same threats that they had in years past?
I think it's worse than naive. I think it's deceptive because basically what the administration has been doing is using what an academic economist might use as a parlor trick of just assuming a problem away or redefining the problem so it's easier to solve. And notion of a core of al-Qaeda is something that didn't exist prior to the Obama administration. They've so minimized the mission in Afghanistan to make it seem like this is all very achievable and something will be all wrapped up when he declares the war over at the end of next year. But while they may have made a blow on this true or false core al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, Islamist networks and extremist networks have been unleashed on an unprecedentedly large area. And the bottom line is we are not safer. Al-Qaeda may be more shadowy, but it is not less destructive and not less animated today than it was in 2001.
He had said that we don't need to send thousands of soldiers to, quote, occupy other nations, which I thought was very interesting language, and then turned around in the very next breath and said that we need to help countries like Yemen, Libya, and Somalia, help them provide their own security and back up our allies who fight with terrorists in other countries. I hate the phrase neocon, Stephen. I really, really do, because I think it's so inaccurately applied by people who don't understand what it means. But in the context of those individuals' definitions, wouldn't that classify this president as such?
Yeah, well, I frankly found so many schizophrenic elements of what he was saying. On the one hand, he is an ideological global peacenik by sort of rolling back to nuclear zero and declaring the tide of war is receding, and also some echoes of this neocon notion of nation building in these failed states. And people basically just don't hold them to account, but these things don't reconcile. Frankly, I find it offensive to present the notion the United States has been out there occupying other countries. I mean, we have sacrificed for the freedom of a lot of other people to take their fate into their own hands, majority of which have been Muslim. And this president basically takes that gratitude away from the service that these people have rendered on behalf of humanity.
Right. What did you make of his remarks on the cyber attacks? I don't know, I wasn't expecting that to surface in the State of the Union speech. Was that a slap at China?
It is a slap at China, but, it doesn't do us much good to have rhetorical slaps against China. It's a big, tough, well-organized, well-funded state. And so I think that's basically on the positive side of the schizophrenic ledger of the address. It's good to talk about this kind of threat. China isn't the only element of it, but we should have very robust investment, research and development, and deployable options for cyber attacks against our enemies and defense against cyber attacks from our enemies.
What was the most troubling thing for you in the President's State of the Union address last night?
I have to say the most troubling thing to me, I think it affects national security broadly, but it's really this whole notion that we're going to continue to spend outrageous amounts of deficits. And he held up the notion that this isn't somehow adding a dime to those deficits.
Yes.
But the deficit we have already is ferociously large. Not adding to it isn't the problem. Getting it to roll back is what makes our economy healthy and strong. Will be a backbone for an influential America in the years to come. What
did you make of the responses? We had the response from both Marco Rubio and Rand Paul. I thought they were both very good, both very different approaches. What were your thoughts on their responses?
Well, they were very different stylistically and in terms of tone. On balance, I don't find it terribly effective to have too many responses to the State of the Union. In many ways, it's a losing proposition to be a respondent in the State of the Union. I think neither man really did himself harm in doing it, which I guess is sort of the Hippocratic oath of doing it. But I don't know that we really moved the needle. The president's address always is so large. And really, I think Marco Rubio did an adequate and perhaps good job of at least laying down a couple of markers about what Republicans stand for and what they don't, so that maybe some of the president's branding of them is at least malleable to the point of Republicans being able to push back.
That's a hard gig to have, to have any response after the State of the Union. That's a tough gig. Right. It's late. The president, almost every president, has rolled on longer than he needed to. Audiences are tired. They probably had more of politics than they wanted for the evening. And then here you are to try to bend their ear for 15 more minutes. Right. Exactly. Stephen Yates with the D.C. International Advisory. Thanks, Stephen, for joining us the second time this week. We always appreciate your expertise. Anytime. Thank you, Dana. Take care.